Okay, we are back in Exodus chapter 22. Should have cleaned my glasses first. My understanding is we got through verse 4 last week. Is that about what y'all recall? Exodus chapter 22. Uh, we looked at verses 1 through 4. So let's look at verses 5 and 6. Uh, if a man lets a field or vineyard be grazed bare and lets his animal loose so that it grazes in another man's field, he shall make restitution from the best of his own field and the best of his own vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads to thorn bushes, so that stacked grain or the standing grain of the field itself is consumed, he who started the fire shall surely make restitution. Speaking of little fire starter, glad Dolores is here. So, what do we think about that? Okay. Any other thoughts on it? It kind of gives us a glimpse of their culture and one of the issues that we have in agricultural settings, kind of like ours, although we don't have a lot of ranching around here, at least not that I see. Um, there's some, of course, but you got to manage your range effectively. And one of the issues for that is to not take it down to too low of a level, move the sheep around, move the cattle around. Um, the sheep in particularly are known to, and probably the goats as well, to take the range grass and everything down to the very lowest level. They'll eat just really rough down to the bottom, whereas cattle are a little more picky and don't quite do that as much. At least that's every Glenn Ford movie I saw. You know, the sheepmen and the cattlemen were fighting over that kind of thing. So, but range management is a big deal, and it has a lot to do with fire prevention. And I guess if it gets chewed down too much, it dries out and becomes even more prone to catching fire. I really thought the image of the thorn bushes being used as fence, they're stacked up um, and used to kind of keep animals out of maybe the stored grain uh, or just to define a field. They didn't really have our type of contemporary fencing materials, but they used the thorn bush, and it was probably pretty effective. I saw an interesting portrayal of African village life the other day, and they have their mud huts, which are pretty basic dwellings, but they've lived in them for a long time. And their door is a big old thorn bush. They just moved that door. Now that's not going to keep out every animal in the world, but it will keep out a lot of animals, and makes for a relatively secure um closure to the house. So the thorn bush here is kind of a fence. You're dividing the fields. You're protecting the grain from the animals so they don't get into it and consume it, rather than allowing you to make it into what you want it to be or sell it at a profit. And arson is just really a very uh, fearful prospect. I think we have a young lady in our group that is has a relative who's facing some liability over a fire that was started. It's still, um, I'm not going to get too much more into detail than that. And I don't know a lot more than that, but it is a very dangerous and costly occurrence. So something to be avoided, and the restitution for these things is really supposed to come from the best. You don't get to cheap out when you're making a repayment. It's going to be something that is maybe a little bit punitive in the sense that you're going to be paying maybe a little bit more than you caused the loss. But that's part of it too, and it just reflects the kind of the fragility of their existence that it can so easily be destroyed. Any other thoughts before we move on?
Can you help me understand the formulas a little better? What, what was the original purpose of those?
Well, they would use them as fencing material, stack them up to keep the animals from going through uh, from one field to the another, or if they had something pinned up or whatever. You kind of use whatever you have around. You go to Ireland or Scotland, you'll see all those rock fences.
So the owner of land was trying to keep his neighbor's
Or just defining his property, keeping maybe his own. If it's a store of grain, might be keeping his own animals out of that. Cattle, uh, they don't really care whose name is on the grain. So,
the scripture just brought back a memory. It's been a long time, and I never really, there was one incident where we had to deal with the law. Some places have what they call open range.
mm-hmm.
They're open range areas, so it's on the landowner to keep the critters out, not the other way around. So I mean, it's just interesting.
And with
Also,
it,
if you really had a claim against somebody's animals, then you know they pasture in
it's
that case.
you have a nomadic peoples in this area. All the different tribes, all the different clans are. You have to move them around. That's one reason you do have shepherds is because they will eat everything down to the nub, and you have to move them from one place to the next so they have fodder, but so that they can leave it where it will come back more quickly. And the That's an interesting idea that it's on you to protect your own thing. But even if there it is, there's only so much you can do, isn't there? And so they used the fencing material they had available to them, which would be thorns. They didn't have um, better different barbed wire, razor wire. They didn't have a lot of wood, even really a lot of trees. So wood was precious, and this is a probably, and yet they could probably grab it. They figured out a way to grab it and move it around when they needed to protect their hands. So,
Which I didn't until we read this and you explained about this. I thought the form was just something drawing. I didn't realize it. But as I think back when I was in Albania in the 90s, and they had thorn hedges
mm-hmm.
around their vineyards, around their whatever kind of fruit trees they had, and it was a much cheaper peat wise than it was to keep the.
Well, what
But they were about four or
it
five
does
years.
the same basic job as barbed wire.
As soon as you said that, then it dawned on me what this really meant is they have a thorn barrier, and that's what they had there. There was no wood fence, there was no metal post. They had cane material, which they got probably from the river that they stuck down to keep it vertical. But that was it. Otherwise, it was just the bush itself that had really long. You wouldn't want to mess with it. So yeah, that's what they had. That's what they used. It was not free because you had to tend it and fix it.
Represents a lot of labor and probably some blood along with your sweat and tears on it. So,
That's the dogs and the animals and people out of yourself. So yeah, it just never dawned on me that what this was really saying was it was a barrier around their store grain, not just.
and yet it's not going to, with all that investment, that how effective it is at that level,
Well, that
it
was
is
it.
no good defense against fire
Well, that was
because the thorns will go right through the fire will go right through the thorns.
a lot of labor to get that
Mm-hmm.
grain stored. Because I
So,
remember my mom talking about threshing and going out and getting the bundles of grain by hand.
Was she threshing at the bottom of a wine press?
Not quite,
Okay.
not quite. Good close.
Your mom's name wasn't Gideon, huh?
But good like rain, that's how it is.
Gideona.
Well, that's why I mentioned it. And you just shake your head when you see all this machinery and this tractor, very little handles, but not here.
They these are ancient cultures, and we can still see cultures in the world today where they live very similar to this, not identical, but very similar.
Close enough to
Uh,
get an idea.
yeah, they found a way to adapt and be human, be fully human in uh, climates and in situations where if you put us into them tomorrow, we'd be dead the next day probably. I mean, they are they're very resilient and adaptable, and you know it would be tough to. Uh,
I guess the thing about it too, that if you go into a thorn bush back then, where do you go to get treated for it too if you get an infection? People tended, and the same thing I observed there in LA, people when they worked, the way in which they worked was very, I was going to say unique for their circumstances, knowing that if
it's
they got,
primitive.
yeah, if they got hurt, it was on them. There was no hospital. One of my students was a close friend. I used to hear about Angelo. Angelo's great grandfather died while I was there in the 90s. And they took him to the hospital. They had to supply his sheets, his bedding, his meals, everything.
Well, the hospital here will give you all that. They're just going to charge you a whole lot of money for
But there it
you
was
know
just expected. And I went by the hospital and I saw
$500 for a pair of sheets.
across from this one person who was filling up the meals on a rope on the second floor. They had a thing that they could attach it. Just, it's just crazy. They use what they have.
Hmm.
I saw a lot of that type of thing going on. But they used what was available. They couldn't afford. I bought a fan for myself because it was very humid, Mediterranean,
Hmm.
and I left it there with one of my students. He didn't want to take it because he couldn't have afforded to buy it. So,
A lot of people who go back to the old country go to those kind of very, and I don't mean to use primitive in a negative sense.
no,
It's
it's
just,
where man has been for a lot of years.
it's just they haven't acquired all of the advancements. Whether they are that is a different question. But I have an uncle who's Bulgarian extraction, and he was in Bulgaria with his daughter. He didn't really want to go, but his daughter just harangued him, and my cousin harangued him. Take me back to see the old country. And they went over there to Bulgaria and they saw it, and it's outhouses rather than flush toilets. It's very basic, hard work at every turn and all that. And I love my cousin very dearly. She's not used to that kind of stuff. She hasn't been around. I haven't done a lot of it, but I kind of know enough to know that ain't me. So, so, so my cousin, I love her. I'm glad she had got that experience. She got out of it, but they left. They left all their clothes, their underwear, everything because these people don't have anything. They're happy to get your used underwear because they don't have underwear, I guess, or whatever. So it's
She takes some of my socks because I had no socks.
mm,
So I put 2 weeks before I washed again.
they couldn't believe that now.
But she
Mm.
saw all my socks. She says, "Can I get those socks home to my dad?" She said, sure. But I didn't understand why until later. That he had one or two pairs of socks that he
Well,
used to. Her dad was a teacher
and America has come, by and large, come a long way in the last 100 years. It wasn't that long ago where we weren't that different than the other countries. My grandmother had to wear a dress to school. She got to go to school, but she had to wear a dress to school every day, and she only had one dress. So every day she came home from school, the first thing to do was wash the dress, hang it up to dry every day. So the stuff we take for granted, and whether it's a good development, a positive development, or a negative development, is kind of how you choose to look at it, I guess. Um, but it's these ancient cultures; they didn't have all of that. And there's other stories where it shows that even just multiple sets of clothing is a big deal. Everything is a big deal. They just didn't have a lot of material possessions, and they had to And it kind of reflects why these property crimes sometimes are treated so severely. It's one thing if you steal the car of a man who has fully insured, and you take his car and he's kind of glad because he wanted one with a different color anyway, and the insurance company cuts a check and he upgrades or whatever. That's still a loss, isn't it? When you do that, everybody in America basically pays for that. They spread the insurance costs out over everybody, so you're still creating a loss, but it's not, maybe we're not as attached or as needy of everything we have, as needful of everything we have, as they might have been there, because there's just no, in a sense, there's really no replacing it. If you replace the best, something that happens like this, and you use the best of your vineyard, but the best of your vineyard isn't as good as the worst of your neighbor's vineyard, it's still a loss. You're doing all you can, but it's still a net loss for your neighbor. So, materialism, Jesus, I think, is one of the big themes of his teachings, and the one we don't really talk about, and I include myself in that a lot. One of the big things he talks about is not being materialistic. And um, poor people can be just as materialistic as wealthy people. It's over maybe different things, but the people who go down and get a set of spinning rims on their car that cost more than the car, that type of thing. The kids who kill other kids for $300 pair of tennis shoes, it happens. Um, so materialism is not exclusively the purview of the wealthy. It's something can happen. It crosses all these lines. These laws can somewhat come across as being materialistic, like you are putting human life and tangible things, replaceable things, at the same level, almost anyway. The thing is, they weren't really easily replaceable, and the life of the person that is suffering the loss is hanging in the balance. So it's a different world. We look at it, and it's, if you're my dad and mom had their credit card act the other day, and they got a call. Are you buying a bunch of fishing equipment in Southern California at Walmart? And nope, that kind of thing. And then it got hacked again. The replacement card got hacked. So it's it doesn't matter really to them. They get the money back. It doesn't matter to Walmart. They sold all that stuff. So the rest of us are all paying for it, and mom and dad are paying for it. Proportionately themselves too, and they have to deal with all the hassle. But um, it's a different world, a different situation where tangible things, property things, and humanity itself are so closely related to one another, and that when you rob from someone, you are killing them in a way. And so when we see these laws address uh, property in a way that maybe we would not like it to be addressed, we have to understand, I think, hopefully, we can understand that, again, as we've said before, this is not God's final word on all of these things. If He wants your cloak, give Him your shirt too. Is much closer to the final word on these things. But it is a recognition of the reality of the cultures that they were in. And just using thorn bushes as fencing material, is a sign that these words are going into a culture. They're going into, and so it's not just these words that are going into a culture, it's all of the words that are going into a culture. And that gets, I think, a little trickier as the laws kind of progress. Okay, let's look at verses 7 through 9. When we get into the issue of bailment. If a man gives his neighbor money or goods to keep for him, and it is stolen from the man's house, if the thief is caught, he shall pay double. If the thief is not caught, Then the owner of the house shall appear before the judges to determine whether he laid his hands on his neighbor's property. For every breach of trust, whether it is, let's see, whether it is for ox, for donkey, for sheep, for clothing, or for any lost thing about which one says, "This is it." The case of both parties shall come before the judges. He whom the judges condemn shall pay double to his neighbor. Okay, what do you think about that?
Well, here in what I'm reading, it says, the one who God condemns will pay double to his
Yes.
neighbor. What are you talking about? Someone else directed by God to judge this? If God judging this correct?
Okay, that's an interesting point, and it's the handout has it. The word for God here is not the Hebrew word for God, and so they think they adopted this passage from a pre-existing law, from a pagan law, and the law, the judgment by God, the judgment before God, would have been some kind of trial by ordeal. And it wasn't that long ago where you still had those in the Western world, the whole Spanish Inquisition. We'll find out if you're a witch or not. We'll burn your feet until you tell us you're a witch. That's how we'll get that. So it's an interesting passage, provision of the law, especially considering what happens when we put things in a bailment relationship. When you park your car at the airport, what does the sign say? I'm doing it right now. Not responsible. Yeah. So if someone breaks into the parking lot or walks into the parking lot sometimes and destroys your car, steals your car, that's tough. That sign is not the final word. You cannot put a sign up that abrogates your duty. That doesn't do it necessarily. It's going to depend on state laws and other factors that come into play as well. But bailment is when you place something of value, property of some kind, in the care of another person with the expectation of getting it back. And perhaps you would do it, and the laws really kind of factor in, are they getting paid to accept that property and hold it safely? Are they doing it as a friend, as a neighbor? Will you watch my dog? Can I bring my dog over? You watch him while I go on my European vacation or whatever. That's a bailment. But if you're not paying your neighbor to watch your dog, but then if you do pay your neighbor, what if you pay your neighbor $20 a day because the kennel is 40 a day, and your neighbor's dog likes your dog or whatever? These are all kind of factors, different forms of bailment, different forms of holding someone else's property in trust for them. They are supposed to get it back. And the idea, I think, in this context is certainly that the person holding the property is doing it more or less out of the goodness of their heart, more or less to help their neighbor out, rather than making a lot of money on it. But it could be it could be a business arrangement, because this understands the practice of agricultural bailment, which if you've got a herd of cattle and one bull, and he's got a herd of cattle and one bull, and you want to swap bulls, and one bull goes and one bull comes over here, and the one that goes gets killed, and the one that's here is fine. You get into all of these matters, and we've kind of talked about this to some extent already. But that's where it might happen in a more primitive, perhaps agrarian society. You're not always paying for bailments. It's not always parking at the parking lot. Here, the parking lot at the airport's free, isn't it? Now, you're not going to beat that deal anywhere in America. I haven't heard of that at a parking lot anywhere in a very long time. So Dolores knows a place, I guess, but it's nice it's a very nice arrangement. course, there's only one flight a day in and out, so I mean, it still has to kind of meet your schedule. But uh, we have this in a more urban, more industrialized culture. The idea of bailment is going to be for money. Somebody's going to hold the bank, hold your money for profit. The elevator, hold your wheat for profit. I don't know if Doug was here. He's been several months since he was here, but Doug was on one end of this when a grain elevator goes bankrupt. Yeah, the farmers get really mad, and they may go down there and try to get their grain back. The thing is, it's not their grain anymore. It's everybody's grain, and they have a portion of that grain. Then they have a prorated portion based on how much they put in, but they don't get all of it back. They get whatever is there, and it gets tied up, and it can take years, and it's a real mess. But it's so bailment is a very important part of human interaction. We pay for it as a rule. It's a financial um, commitment for us. Here it might have been more neighborly, more friendly, um, but still have had financial issues. And if you loan or if you put some property in your neighbor's care and it turns up missing, who's the number one suspect? If you give your neighbor some sheep um, to watch, and your sheep turn up missing, and he's walking around in a new wool jacket, eating lamb kebabs, I don't know what happened to him. It looks suspicious, doesn't it? And so that's where the trial by ordeal. We can't really prove. A lot of times you can't prove what happened. You don't know. You didn't see it. Well, again, we'll dunk your head underwater for 2 minutes at a time, and we'll see what God says about all this. You know, it doesn't sound like you'd get the most reliable verdicts that way. I don't know if we get reliable verdicts now with our system, but it is a property. It is bailment. It's holding the property of someone for another, and there's this attempt. When it goes fine, which is probably most of the time, there's nothing to talk about. But when it goes wrong, it goes very wrong. And I said in the handout, it's generally treated differently than we do. Because generally, if you do something as a favor to someone else, you have a very low standard of care for the most part because you're not benefiting from it. It's just you're being nice. A duty, you are expected to meet your duty. Whatever you expect is one thing, but what your actual duty may be something else. So it's not just what you expect, it's what you actually have to do. Then if you pay for it, on the other hand, and they throw a sign up that says, we're not responsible for anything that happens to your property. Well, we'll see about that. Maybe you aren't, but your standard of care, your duty of care is higher if you're making money on it. You have to take greater care of the property. Maybe if you're running an airport parking lot in Seattle, you need to put a really tall thorn bush or barbed wire, razor wire fence, all that. You need all that stuff. You need to have security guards 24 hours a day because people are parking their 60, 70, 80, $100,000 cars in there for weeks at a time. That's not our car, but that's somebody else's car. We don't have, if they're going to go after the expensive cars, we usually don't have to worry about it where I'm from. We come in under the radar there. So, so it changes. That is our way of handling, and I think ultimately it's better, but at the same time, um, this kind of presumes a relationship between the parties that we don't normally have these days in most of our settings. We're not friends. I don't. We have when we fly out of Seattle, we have one parking lot we almost always use, And I couldn't name you one person that works there, and it's a different person every time. And I'm not sure what their nation of origin is, and I don't care. It's fine, and they do a reasonably good job. For they're not the cheapest and they're not the best, but they're kind of I think, a pretty good combination of value, what you get out of it, and convenience. So that's the one we use. I don't really recommend them, but I wouldn't counsel against using them. But it's an arm's length transaction. It's one person agreeing to pay another one. It's a contract, which is not a meeting of the minds. It's an offer and acceptance. And whatever you think it means, that's up to you. You know, how many times have you bought something and it wasn't what you thought you were getting, and you went back and tried to say, "Well, this wasn't what I was paying for. This wasn't what I wanted to buy." And what do they say usually? They pull out a big contract and say, "Yes." And sometimes there's a low level of deceit involved. And certainly in these cultures, that was almost encouraged. You know, if you get tricked, that's on you. Buyer beware. You know, but that's not really necessarily how it's supposed to be. But this uh, difference in bailment law, I think, is very interesting. And it continues. The verse 9 also kind of rejects the notion of finders, keepers, losers, weepers. I mean, that's the law of the playground, isn't it? You know, if you find the Matchbox car on the playground, boy, that is yours. And whoever lost that Matchbox car, tough. Yeah, you lost it. You can weep now. You're a loser. You weep. I'm a finder. I keep. Well, that's not how it works under the Mosaic Law. If you can identify it, that's yours. You get it back. And was it with uh, double? So well, if you can say that's it, any material thing, this is it. This is mine. Um, one of my favorite Western movies is that's, I guess you would say, fairly recent. It's almost 40 years old now. Silverado. There's a scene where one of the characters is kissing his horse. His horse has been stolen, and he killed the guy who stole it. And now he's being reunited, and his horse is just in there, just kissing each other on the mouth. And the cavalry officer comes up and says, "How do I know that's your horse?" And he goes, "Can't you tell this horse loves me?" And the guy said, the colonel in the cavalry said, "I had a gal do that to me once. Didn't make her my wife, you know." So, but it was his horse, and all happy ending there. The thing. So if you can say that's it and identify your property, the fact that you lost it, the fact that somebody else lost it for you, it's yours. It was always supposed to be yours. And that's because what God gave Israel, He gave them as an inheritance. It's from Him. They didn't really get it out on the open market. They didn't save up their money and buy it. God gave it to them. And when He gives it to you, it's yours. So if you find someone else's matchbook car and they say they lost that's their matchbook car that they lost, you give it back to them. That's just, so it's a different standard. I think, it's obviously ripe for abuse as well, but where you have a relationship, all of this kind of presumes a relationship between the parties that is really lacking in the world today, at least in our world. We're not that close to each other as they were back then. Okay, verses 10 through 15. I'm going to let y'all talk for a little bit. Then I'm going to go sneeze. The law concern, we'll read it out here, won't we? If a man gives his neighbor a donkey with an ox, a sheep, or any animal to keep for him, and it dies, or is hurt, or is driven away while no one is looking, an oath before the Lord shall be made by the two of them that he has not laid hands on his neighbor's property. And its owner shall accept it, and he shall not make restitution. But if it is actually stolen from him, he shall make restitution to its owner. If it is torn to pieces, let him bring it as evidence. He shall not make restitution for what has been torn to pieces. If a man borrows anything from his neighbor, and it is injured or dies while its owner is not with it, he shall make full restitution. If its owner is with it, he shall not make restitution. If it is hired, it came for its hire. Okay, what do y'all think about that? That's a little more purely agricultural in nature.
I guess the comment I would make is, it seems like it's common sense type ideas. I get the feeling that for it to be written down by God and presented to people here, that there must have been things happening that God could see and say, this is what I want. Here's what you need to be doing. It seemed like the people were more willing to take advantage of this was, to me, as I read this, it doesn't surprise me. I'm like, maybe it's my property. It's the way I was taught by my parents. But then I can realize that both my parents had, my dad, well, was a preacher. My mother's grandfather was a preacher. So they were both raised with these kind of, maybe it's just in me, but it just seems like it's, why did they need to write it down? There must have been a reason. Something must have been going on in society that God determined he had to make the rules and everybody, people said, this way you'll do it.
Well, the thing about livestock and bad things happen sometimes. It's just
Yeah.
they absolutely are not always preventable. And
We got a dog that ate some plastic, we had to take it down.
and your dog isn't livestock, Robert. It's a pet. Okay.
It's big enough, it's 5 pounds, it's big enough to eat. Well, just a dog.
Ooh.
So anyway, so I understand. Good. But yeah, it seems like as we've gone through all of this, in the back of my mind is the idea, to me anyway, this is common sense. If you borrow something, if I loan you something, and something happens to it, I didn't loan it to you anticipating you would lose it or break it or whatever, you get it destroyed. But I'm not upset, I wouldn't have given it to you and let you use it. I mean, that's the way I was brought up, unless something.
Again, this is perhaps a business arrangement at times. You're borrowing a bull to breed with your cattle or whatever.
Well, I said, it must be
Um,
something more here than
and it does acknowledge that despite the best of intentions, even around here, you might have cattle and go out one day and there's a cougar eating one of your, dead cattle or something. So you can't absolutely prevent all of those things. Um, so there is this. It's interesting. I think the production of the carcass that's been torn to pieces. I guess presumably, particularly for keeping the kosher diet, the carcass would reflect the fact that it was not butchered, slaughtered and butchered according to the kosher principles. Uh, but it harkens back to the Joseph story. When his brothers sell him into slavery, they bring the father the tattered garment, the tattered coat of many colors with blood on it, dipped in blood, and Jacob accepts that as proof that Joseph is dead. We didn't have DNA. We didn't even have blood typing back then. So if you watch, a lot of the old movies, they, oh, that's the right blood type, all right, like that. I mean, there's only a handful of blood types. It could have been someone else that had that blood type, but that's it's proof. It's a tangible form of proof that has a lot of weight behind it. It's generally given. This means that something happened that wasn't the holder of the property's fault, the borrower, I guess you would say, in some senses.
But then if the owner of the lender is present when something happens, then the borrower isn't.
Well, I think, what we're seeing also is the resolution of these problems when the parties can't work it out themselves. Most of the time, if you're friendly, your neighbors, you go back and forth, something bad happens, you understand, and the person wouldn't do this to you intentionally. I hope we all have a friend somewhere in the world that if you had $1 million cash and you needed someone to hold on to it for a while, you could give it to that friend and know that they wouldn't lose it, that they wouldn't spend it. If not, they might get killed and it might get stolen from them, but they're not going to. They're going to hold it in sacred trust for you. It's your property. You need them as a friend, and hopefully, we're all that type of friend too. I don't know if I am or not. $1 million in cash, I don't know, but hopefully, uh, we have those types of relationships in our lives. And Israel, this is a family. It's not just neighbors, friends and neighbors. It is family. And hopefully you have that relationship with someone, and hopefully they are supposed to have that type of relationship with others. But even when that happens, sometimes there's just a dispute that comes down that can't be resolved in a friendly manner. It can't be resolved between gentlemen or between ladies. It has to go to court, sadly. And I think these are kind of the extreme cases. And at the same time, I don't think we have to look exclusively at the exact provisions of the law and say that's all it means. I think these are kind of guiding principles. And when you have a dispute, you have a problem, these things point you in the right direction, maybe, rather than settling everything. We'll see in chapter 23 the commandment not to boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Does that mean you can boil a young goat in another goat's milk? Can you boil it in a cow's milk, in a sheep's milk? Or does it mean you're not supposed to eat meat with dairy? Well, the Jewish people feel like it means you don't eat meat with dairy. Cheeseburger is not kosher. It is very hard to truly keep kosher in America these days. You go look at your lunch meat and see how much of it has like sodium lactate or something like that. Milk, salts, milk solids, some kind mixed in with the meat. That's inherently not kosher. So they looked at it as kind of the basic principle, the basic guideline. And what does it mean as our culture evolves? How do we understand this differently? And I think that's a good thing. I think that's why we can see in the time of Jesus, when somebody's holding a big feast, people on the fringe of the culture can come in and basically make a plate for themselves. That's their form of gleaning, allowing the poor to eat. They don't have big wheat fields anymore. They're merchants now. They're in cities. How do we let the poor glean? This is how. And that doesn't mean you have everything worked out or all the problems figured out. But I think, it's fine to look at these laws. How do they fit into our culture? How does taking the precise text put them into our culture? Then how does the general principle fit into our culture? And a lot of times we can't take the precise text and put it in our culture, but we can take the general principle, what's behind it, what's God trying to accomplish, and try to have that work out in our culture. Okay, thank you for your attention and your comments, and it probably would have worked fine today.